Welcome once again to the Pieces of Systematic Review with Margaret Foster. This is the final session. Margaret, as well as our office, wanted to have one last session to do a wrap-up of the series and to allow for further question and answer time. Thank you for everyone for joining us this morning. As always, it is a pleasure to introduce Margaret, the Associate Professor at Texas A&M University and Systematic Reviews Coordinator at the Medical Sciences Library with a joint position at the School of Public Health and the College of Medicine of the Texas A&M University Health Sciences Center. Margaret has a great session planned today. We'll see how far we've come in this series. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and close out that reporting poll. Thank you for those of you who finished that. And as soon as that is closed, I will pass it over to Margaret and let her get started with her session. So closing out the poll now. Just a few more seconds for that. All right, so I'll go ahead and switch it over now to Margaret's PowerPoint, and I'll give her moderator privileges. Good morning, Margaret.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning, where we're going to be wrapping up this series and hopefully answering any last questions you have and taking a look back at everything that we've talked about so far. So I kind of wanted to give you an idea about why I wanted to do this series in the first place. So we had kind of a brainstorming session, and I really thought about the most frequent questions that I get from other librarians, a chance to really discuss how to apply the standards, because there's lots of standards out there. You can read what they say, but when you're really getting down to it, what does that mean when you're trying to help someone conduct a review? So one thing that I use when talking about reviews is I use the acronym PIECES. And so you've seen this many times before, and it's really a way to help those that I'm consulting with remember the steps easily. And it's also nice to have a nice picture that I can put on slides to have the puzzle pieces. The other part of it is that when I think about a puzzle, you know, we put all the pieces down on the table, and there's a lot of detail work, just like there's a lot of detail work in systematic reviews where you've got, you know, hundreds, sometimes thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of articles to sort and go through, and then you put it all together. But throughout the process, you have to remember the picture on the box. You have to remember what you're trying to build to begin with. And systematic reviews have a lot of that requirement of thinking about the big picture, but also the little pieces that you have to put together. So through the sessions, we answered these 6 questions. We started off with, how do you determine if a research question is right for a systematic review? This is the part which I actually think is the most difficult for all of the parts of doing the process. Because once you have a really good question, designing the search, you can follow the best practices. There are tools to help with the other parts of it. Really the hardest part is figuring out what do you do, and we'll go over what we've talked about so far in the sessions over that. And then we moved on to searches beyond the typical databases. We did a question and answer session because I felt like there were so many questions in those first 2 sessions that we didn't get to all of them. And then we started talking about what happens after the search. We talked about free software. And then we went into talking about other types of reviews, and new developments is where we ended up last. Well, I guess it wasn't that long ago. And then we have today, so we're going to summarize and take a few slides from each of those sessions and kind of go back through them and see what lingering questions you might still have. So in session 1, we looked at, is the systematic review method right for the research question? what is the scope of the review, and how will that review fit into research that's already out there. These are the 5 steps that I use when determining if a question is feasible. So first is just thinking about their question. So, you know, sometimes when you first hear the question, it's hard, you realize right away, oh, this isn't going to fit with the systematic review because it's way too narrow, it's way too specific, or it's way too broad. Or maybe you talk with a patron and you realize they're calling something a systematic review that's, you're not having the same definition of a systematic review. And then you've got to determine, after you figure out, okay, this might work for a systematic review method, then what is the scope of the review? And that's where you're talking about what is the framework of the question, what is the eligibility criteria for the studies they're looking for. Sometimes they will use the term inclusion-exclusion criteria. I try and stick with a more general term of eligibility criteria because in the end, it's all in how you phrase it. So I could say I only want things that are in English as an inclusion criteria, or I could say and excluding everything not in written in English or something like that. And then the next thing before we get too far down the road is trying to find and evaluate any related reviews. So we want to make sure that the topic hasn't been already done, especially recently, and you also need to be aware of all the other related reviews that are out there on the topic so that those can be written up in the background and also into the discussion, because you want to describe where the results of that systematic review fit into what's already been published. The same idea, and it's the same thing we do when collecting primary studies and write a lit review for that. Then you need to have some kind of idea how many potential citations are we talking about. And this, I just try and give them a rough estimate, and this helps me to kind of figure out how much time are we talking about going through here. So that if you just have maybe a couple hundred, that might not take quite as long as a search that pulls back thousands. And sometimes their question and the eligibility criteria, the concepts themselves are very, have so many synonyms that it's really hard to narrow down a search. And then sometimes the topic is uses such specific language that it's easy to keep that the citation number down. And of course, we can't really control that. We have to do what's appropriate. So then once you combine all of that together, that's how you're going to determine the feasibility. And I have, oh, okay. I thought I had the slides mixed up here. That's okay. So in determining if the question matches a systematic review method, you've got to have the same language. And so I kind of put this slide together because I hear this term so often from the students, sometimes from professors who say, oh, I'm going to do a systematic review. I'm not realizing there are lots of other types of reviews out there. And just because you do a lit review systematically, that doesn't make it a systematic review. And I think throughout this series, I've heard from many of you with the same issue. So I put lots of different terms out there on here that we've seen before. Her favorite slide. So we hear systematic review, narrative, literature, integrative, realist. There's so many different types out there. The main thing when I'm talking with researchers about this, what you call it is going to be important, but it's most important that we both agree on what we're trying to accomplish so that I can make the best suggestions for them. And for some of the types, there are standards that are written. For other types, there's just a little bit out there on how to do them. So of course, for systematic reviews, we have the standards from Cochrane, from the Campbell collaboration, Joanna Briggs, lots of standards out there. We haven't seen that many standards out there for the integrative. Recently, there has been a standard written up for the realist reviews. So we're just starting to get and have more guidance on how to do these other types. So I thought it might help to think about the types in a couple of different ways. So I have one slide here where I've put it together as a continuum. And I used this, a version of this slide in session 5, and I made some updates to it that I hope will help here. So I've kind of put these lines in here, and the lines indicate when you're moving into another kind of type of review. So I put narrative on one side, and lots of reviews, of course, fall into this. And then once you start to describe your methods, you might be getting more into a mapping review or a scoping review. And those aren't synonyms. Those are two different types of reviews. Two types which I often confuse. The line hasn't been quite drawn between them. You'll see, I see a lot of scoping reviews that I would really say are mapping reviews. And then you have another line where you're going to be appraising the articles. And in that, the systematic review, all of the studies in that systematic review, they're all going to be trying to answer the same research question. So that's where I put systematic review and meta-analysis on one side of that. And I have another slide where we're going to talk about different types of systematic reviews in there. And then there's another type of review where you still appraise the studies, you still describe your methods, but you're almost answering a couple of different questions within one review, and that's the realist reviews. So systematic reviews, for the most part, are trying to answer a very narrow question. Is this effective? Is this the best screening tool? Things like that. In a realist review, you're trying to say, who does this, sometimes it's an intervention, who does this work for? And why does it work, things like that. And so in that, they're answering multiple questions and might look at multiple types of studies. And it's not that in a systematic review you can't look at multiple types of studies, it's just that all of those studies you're looking at are trying to answer the same research question. So when I think about the review, I can think about it as a spectrum, moving from the very subjective to more objective ways of looking at the literature, going from a very broad question to very narrow question, and in that we see a lot of variety. So this next slide is just another way of looking at the reviews. So I kind of put all of those descriptive reviews. So narrative reviews, scoping reviews, mapping reviews, those are all ways of looking at the literature. Okay, you could almost put bibliometric analysis in here because I've seen some of those which I would say that's a mapping review. And then for different types of systematic reviews, you can think about them in different ways. A rapid review is just a systematic review done quickly. And so we're starting to see some standards out there of how do you do them, but basically you're just saying, okay, we did this really fast. Then there's also the living systematic review, and that's a review that it keeps getting updated with a certain time schedule. You could also think about reviews by the type of study that is included. So definitely from Cochrane, we see mostly quantitative systematic reviews where they'll only want to look at randomized control trials. Then we have reviews that are only want to look at qualitative. Then we have those that want to combine those together. And Joanna Briggs is one organization which really encourages systematic review authors to include both types. And then we also have the umbrella review, which is a review of reviews. And then I kind of put realist reviews in its own area because those are reviews that are answering multiple questions within one review. So I hope these slides kind of help to give a little bit different way of organizing or thinking about review types. And I think the question I get asked the most often is, what is the difference between a scoping review and a mapping review? And we talked about that a lot last time. And there's going to be a webinar from MLA coming up soon on scoping reviews. I think they're also going to talk about mapping reviews in there. So I think the more times I hear it, the more it helps me as well. But just know that right now there aren't really a lot of standards out there, although Cochrane now does have a standard, has a guideline for how to do a scoping review. So I think we're going to start to see a lot more guidance on how to do those. We've kind of already gone through those steps here, so I'm going to go to the next slide. So then the factors to consider are how many studies do you, when trying to figure out should you do this review question, is it going to make sense? So one thing I look at is, are there enough studies? Now there's actually not a number to say, oh, you have to have at least 3 studies to do a systematic review. I've seen systematic reviews published where they only had 2 articles, 2 studies, and I've seen them where they had over 100. Also, Cochrane has, I think it was said, about a quarter of their systematic reviews are basically just protocols because they have no studies. There's no studies have been done yet that would go into that review. But sometimes because of who the audience for the review, there is this number that they're looking at. So if I'm working with a graduate student on a thesis or dissertation, the committee might say that. If somebody is trying to publish a systematic review somewhere, maybe the journal editor would say, oh no, we're not going to take this systematic review because you only have 3 or something. So, but there's nothing in the method itself that says there has to be a certain number. And then once we kind of have an idea of how many citations are we talking about going through, do they have enough time to go through that? Is the scope appropriate for that time period? Do they have the resources they need to do that? So take all of that into consideration. Then in session 2, we moved on to what searches need to be done after you've done the Medline and Embase and that kind of thing. So we looked at what are the standards for those expanded searches, why did we do that? We talked about publication bias, what are the resources and challenges, how do you document, and when do you know when to stop and when to update. So we talked about publication bias, and publication bias, when we're talking about that, it's really when the results of the published studies are systematically different from unpublished studies. And I created this little picture to kind of show what's happening. So if it has significant results, those get easily published, they get quickly published, they're out there. And then other results can sometimes are kind of tossed in the trash. And that happens for lots of reasons. Sometimes the researchers themselves self-select not to publish because they think it won't get published. It's not worth their time to even try. Sometimes journal editors or reviewers will turn away articles, studies, because they're not showing significant results. So lots of reasons, there's lots of reasons for this, and this has been studied a great deal. And what happens then if you don't go and look in lots of other places for maybe a short write-up about something that didn't work, but they still got it in as a conference paper or poster or presentation, then you would never know about those studies that are out there on that match all of your criteria, but maybe are showing that something didn't work. So we looked at the standard from Cochrane, MECR, the Methodological Expectations of Cochrane Intervention Reviews. And what's nice about MECR is that they label everything as mandatory or highly desirable, and you can view these online. So we went through each of those and talked about how to meet the needs of those. So the first one on here, it was asking that if it's important for your question that you search for different types of evidence. So for example, if you were looking at the effectiveness of a certain drug, you might also want to go and look at issues of adverse effects. So you might have to do a different type of search to find those and go to different resources like the FDA, things like that. Then, of course, there's also trial registers, which there's been a big push, especially in the last couple of years, to make sure that those are searched and also that studies are actually registered. So there's a big international push right now for that to happen. We talked about searching the gray literature, and after I got to hear Andrew Booth talk about this a little bit, he was saying there really is no such thing as gray literature. You're really searching for conference papers or dissertations or government reports, but it's kind of the umbrella that over time has kind of become the umbrella term. And then there's the idea of searching within other reviews. I'm not sure why MECR decided to say that this was highly desirable. This is one that I always do, because it's so easy. Once I found those related reviews, I'm always going to look to see what did they include and will that be helpful or included in this review. And then searching the reference list, that's also an easy thing to do. I not only will look at the reference list, but also who has cited the included articles since they came out. And then the last one on this is probably the one that people feel the most intimidated about doing, and that's contacting individuals or organizations. It can be really helpful, though, especially if you've had a hard time finding things or something is a really new topic, or if you know that there's sometimes people use vague language in describing a certain concept that makes it really hard to search. It can be really helpful to do that. Of course, there are challenges in doing all of these. Sometimes your client doesn't want to take on any more citations to go through. Sometimes you can't export those citations that you find in the gray, especially in the gray lit area, to then put into whatever tool you're using to sort things. And it could make it more difficult to document that search because it doesn't have an easy way to do that. I'll always do a print screen if I can't do anything else. And then knowing when to stop, that's another hard part. So when I talk with my clients about when do we stop, it's have we followed the best practices? Have we searched the appropriate databases? Have we followed the standards? Then pretty much we can stop. You never know exactly. It is unknown how many studies are actually out there on a topic. So all we can do is best practices. Let me stop right here and see, has anybody had any challenges in trying to do those expanded techniques or in talking with their patrons about, is this a systematic review that you're trying to do, or is this scoping review? Stop here, see if y'all have any questions. Okay, everybody's so quiet. Maybe having that second, that answer question was a good one. I had a resident ask if they could do a systematic review on their own. Do you recommend having more than one person? So it is recommended that whenever you're doing a systematic review that you have at least 2 people, and that's so that when somebody uses one of the critical appraisal sheets, one of the standards on there is were all of the citations independently screened and appraised and coded, things like that. So they won't meet some of the standards that are needed. There's also been some research showing that reviews published by more than 2 authors are of higher quality because they meet all of the standards. And I think part of that is that requirement. So I would encourage that resident to find someone else, maybe another resident to work with. You just need one other researcher there. But in other fields outside of medicine, it's not a standard yet. Not everyone wants to search for non-English articles. That's a tricky one. You know, being a librarian, as I'm their support, I don't get to always say, no, you can't do that. You've got to search for the non-English ones. I do definitely encourage them to do that. But I also see lots of systematic reviews published where they did limit to English. So I wouldn't consider it like, oh, that's my line, I don't want to help you anymore. But it's definitely something to talk about. Feel like you can't do a complete systematic review search for them because you don't have access to certain databases. And that can sometimes be difficult. For certain topics, it's really important to have a certain set of databases, and for others, it would be nice if you had it, but it's not end of the world. Sometimes what I'll do is then I'll work with another librarian. I'll bring them in, maybe even add them as an author if I need to. But right now where I'm at, I have access to pretty much everything I need, so I haven't had to do that so much. It would be interesting to think about what could be done about that or other things. I know I've heard of people signing up to do trials, but you can only do that so much. So I'm not sure exactly how to address that completely. Students coming in with assignments called systematic reviews, but they're not really. And then what are the standards? So that's a really difficult one to work with because you really have to go and find their professor and find out what's happening. So I have had to do that several times because it's going to be a reoccurring thing. So if every semester they're telling every student you're doing a systematic review and you've got 4 weeks to do it, then those students really are going to be at a disadvantage when they later on read a systematic review. They're going to think, oh, I did one of those too, where their definition may not have been the same. So it's something that I work with them. I talk with them about what exactly is it that you want your students to learn, because then they're going to inundate me with requests for help and be concerned. So someone is asking, which standards are you referring to? So I'm not sure if you're asking me which standards I'm referring to. So when I talk about standards, I talk about MICWR, which is those methodological requirements that Cochrane has. There's a list of standards available on the webpage I set up for this webinar series, and I'll show that at the end here so you can go in and get a link to that. So searching for the Technical Information Center, so that can be a great place to find government reports. And then Bob was talking about there's an online translator for PDFs. So whenever I have someone who wants to include a non-English study into their review, my suggestion is to find somebody who speaks that language and is also interested in your topic, and then to have them code and appraise that study rather than have them or try to go through paying to have it translated. Because really in the end what you need from that study is to have it coded and appraised, and that can potentially take maybe 45 minutes to an hour. So you're not asking for somebody to volunteer a lot of time, and that could potentially be done by putting out a request on a listserv or writing to a professional organization. So that's how I've handled that in the past. Generally, the research groups I've been on have for the most part just limited to English, but I have worked on a few groups where we were able to consider all languages by doing that technique. So I hope that that helps. We'll kind of move on here. In session 3, then, we talked about what happens after the search, and we talked about the evaluation of what you have, so that included screening by title and abstract, and then by full text, and then a risk of bias. We talked about the characteristics that need to be coded from each study, and then different ways of combining them. And then in the end, when you're writing up the report, you need to explain and summarize those results. And then we talked about different ways that you could work with clients on these different steps. So maybe you don't feel comfortable in actually conducting those steps or guiding them through it, but you could definitely show them the standards of what's required, examples, so they can look at other systematic reviews that are out there. You could consider then, once you become more comfortable with it, actually collaborating on that step, and then eventually moving up to leading that step. So we'll look at each of these individually. So during the evaluation stage, the screening, when I'm looking by title and abstract, I'm basically looking for reasons to kick it out or exclude it. I'm not looking for reasons to keep it. So by that I mean, when I'm looking through the title and abstract, I'm looking for, oh, it's not about my population, or it's not about this or that. I'm not looking for, in that title or abstract, it to meet all of my eligibility criteria. Because for the most part, there's going to be some of the criteria on there that really you need to look at the full text to decide. And then during the selection process, that's where I would actually look at the full text and decide, does it match all of my requirements. I like to do my screening by using Rayon, which is a free software that's out there. I think I have about almost 90 reviews running in it right now. For the most part, it's been very helpful, and we can talk about that some more and see if you have any questions about that. And then after, so how do I screen by title and abstract? So there's lots of different software out there. Some people will do their screening in EndNote. Some will export and get everything into Excel. I use Rayon, which is a free online software that allows you to upload RAS, EndNote, files, BibTeX, PubMed files, all kinds of files that you can upload and then sort them right online. So I will type into the chat box here a link to that. And it was in session, I think it was maybe session 4 where I did more of a demonstration about Rayon. So there's a link there. And then the next step, after you've selected by full text the studies you want to include, you really need to sort those citations into studies, because sometimes what you find is that one article doesn't always equal one study. Sometimes one study is described in multiple articles, but you're only going to code that study once. Occasionally, you will see multiple studies in one article. They do that often in veterinary medicine. I'm not sure why. And then the last step on there is to assess for risk of bias. In the end, you're going to get from this work the Prisma flow diagram. And so this is one example on the screen here. During the coding phase, which is also sometimes called the data extraction stage, basically coding for different characteristics that the researchers need in order to answer their question. For the most part, you're looking at questions about the population, about the methods and the results, and I usually add in this part the critical appraisal questions. So I usually describe it as it's going to be a form they're going to create. Sometimes they decide that they're going to do these by printing out a form and filling it in. Sometimes they do it all in Excel by just typing in each characteristic, then becomes a column and typing it in there. My preference is to actually have an online form. So I've done this using Qualtrics, which is an online survey tool that our university subscribes to, and I've also used Google Forms. I find it really helpful to have a form where I can just focus on that one article that I have in front of me. And then from there, that data can be put into tables and be described in the narrative. And then if they're doing a meta-analysis, then they would need some different software to combine those numbers. The last step that we talked about was explain and summarize. And explain is usually the discussion section. So this is basically where you're going to explain the results of your coding and your critical appraisal. And here's the 4 basic things that they need to include in there. As a librarian, the part that I usually help with is in the strengths and the weaknesses of the study, specifically talking about how the search is affected, could have affected the strengths or weaknesses of the review. So if they decided that they only wanted to include English studies, then I could bring up the fact that this may have excluded studies that should have been included. So that's my chance to kind of put in those issues potentially for publication bias. In the summarize part, this is another place where, as a librarian, I could come in and help, showing them the standards of how do you write up the review. So we could look to Prisma, which Prisma is expanded to also include how to write up an abstract, a protocol, different things like that. Sometimes I help them in the area of determining the order of the authors. Should they consider open access journals? Which journals should they publish in? So there's a lot of room in there that we can help. Some of the journals now are requiring that authors have an ORCID ID, and so I'm going through and helping them to figure out how do they create one of those. So you have different things that we can help in this section. And then, of course, they have to have their list of references. That could be another area. In session 4, we focused on software, and we talked about, I especially focused on free software. And so I talked about how I was looking for something that's easy, cheap, and it meets the needs of what I'm trying to do. We talked about there's some software that's out there specifically for reviews, and then I described on a few products how I've used it. So when considering the whole process of the reviews, there are some software out there, a lot of which is not free and is very expensive. I've never got to try out Distiller or EpiReviewer, so I just found this information from their website. I have looked at the HAWK, which is the Health Assessment Workspace Collaborative one that's used to do reviews on chemicals, especially in their environmental harm. I have looked at JBI. I've done a little bit in RevMan, and CADMA is also one that I've looked a little bit. It's interesting in that it was originally designed to focus on crop genetic reviews, but they've kind of expanded to be more flexible. So I'm still kind of been playing with that and looking at it, but I haven't done a lot of work in that. Mostly what I do is I have a spreadsheet that I design to kind of capture each step of the way, and then I use Rayon for my sorting. So I think I have on the next slide, some of the other software. So in searching, there's some software that's available out there to help with that. So there's MedTerm Search Assist, which is basically a database of different topics where you can go and see if somebody else already tried to search that concept, and you yourself can add concepts and topic search terms in there as well. The Yale Mesh Analyzer, that was designed to put in PubMed IDs, and then it will show you all of the headings that were attached with those articles. And so I had some slides showing how that works. For sorting, there's Rayon, there's Abstractor. I've had a lot better luck with Rayon than Abstractor simply because Rayon is able to accept lots of different types and work files and work with lots of databases beyond PubMed. For coding and appraisal, I've used Google Forms and Qualtrics, and I've also used this tool that's available from ARC called the Systematic Review Data Repository. This is free software that's online, and basically you can go in, you can set up a review, set up some coding forms on there, and then you could publish those completed coding forms as a database. And so I've worked on a couple of grants where one of the requirements of the grants were that those, all of the data from the review would be publicly available. And that was an easy way to do it. It's a little bit clunky, but I think it works pretty good. Can grade be used to produce summary of findings table? I think grade is more for just appraisal. I haven't seen it talked about as a summary of findings. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I don't think so. I think it's more for appraisal. So grade is a standard that came out of Cochrane. Oh, maybe there's a new one called Grade Pro. Okay. I know that grade is used as a way of looking at the overall evidence. So after you have done the risk of bias on each individual study, it's kind of, it's like a framework to then decide as a body of evidence, how do these studies kind of stack up? So I didn't know about that part of it. We talked a little bit about diagrams. If you Google Prisma Flow Diagram Generator, you'll get to a website that you could enter information and it will actually produce the Prisma flow chart for you in lots of different formats, including PDFs, JPEG, GIFs, all of that. We looked at a couple of different meta-analysis tools, and then I also mentioned that it is helpful to consider how's the review team going to communicate, store files in project management. So I had some slides on some different software that's out there for that. In session 5, we talked about how can a librarian support other types of reviews. We went into some of the review types more specifically, and we talked about a little further into their definition of the different review types, some issues and challenges and resources. So I talked a lot at the beginning about other types of reviews, and this is, I think, an area that's going to continue to grow. We're going to keep seeing more guidance on how to do these, and for example, the MLA webinar that's coming up that's going to be focusing on scoping reviews and mapping reviews, I think we're going to continue to see that. So I think looking for things like that will be really helpful. And then our last session, we talked about what are the new developments in reviews, talked about text mining and crowdsourcing. We talked about ways that as researchers you can get involved in systematic reviews, research. And so let's see, there's a question here on Distiller. So Distiller is one of those overall systematic review tools. So I think it was 2 slides back. So Distiller is kind of an overall review software instead of focusing on just one specific aspect. And then we talked about ways of how do you keep up with new developments. So there are journals out there now that are just focusing on systematic review methods. There's websites. There's the MLA Systematic Review SIG, which we have a Tuesday talk every month, which anyone can join. So that is available to you as well. And then there's the website for this webinar, which has a link to, we'll have all the videos on it. As soon as this one's posted, I'll get that one up there. Plus, it has a link to all of the resources that I talk about during the webinar to make it easy to find those. So it has websites, it has citations of research that I talked about, so you can find all of that there as well. And I know that before you go, how long will the recordings be up? I think for a good amount of time. Sarah would have to answer that. So they're available on YouTube right now. And before you go, we have a poll to ask you about what would you like to see in future webinars about systematic reviews, because there's definitely more questions that we can answer. And I will wait here and see if you have any more questions. I don't know if Sarah wants to do that, the poll now.
Hi, I think we'll wait until the recording is over. So if y'all would just stick around a little bit so we can do that poll. But if anyone else does have any questions for Margaret, please put those in the chat box. I did reply. We have the recordings on our YouTube channel, and to my knowledge, they will just be there. Probably not forever. That's probably unrealistic. But at the very least, as long as we remain the office, which will be at least for the next 4 years, and hopefully longer than that. So we have no intention to take the videos down in the future, so they will be available there. Margaret, I think there was also a question about putting the slides on that website that you created.
Oh, sure. I can add those on there. I know they're not on there right now.
Great. And someone asked about the YouTube channel. Our YouTube is actually a section of the National Network of Libraries of Medicine channel, so it's actually really a playlist, but I want to give you all the sites. We have a page on our website where we post all of the archived videos. So if you go to that page for the Systematic Reviews series, all of the links for all of the sessions, including this one as soon as it's up, will be available there. And then, Margaret, I think there's another question about time limits for inclusion.
Sure. So I think what you're saying, so are you saying setting a year limit on for how many studies you want to include when you're getting back few results? So it would just depend on does that time limit make sense? So, you know, if it makes sense to include things that are from the 50s, that's fine, but sometimes it doesn't make sense to combine studies that were done in the 50s with studies that were done in the 2000s. So it really depends more on the concept. It's not, there's not like a standard set answer to your question. So sorry about that. I would have to know more about what you were looking at. So how effective is the deduping in Rayon? Oh, I would say it's more frustrating than effective. So what I've been doing in Rayon lately is I dedupe everything in RefWorks or EndNote first, and then I upload it in there. Because what happens whenever you, let's say I've uploaded my PubMed, and then I upload my Embase citations and I dedupe them all, but then we decide, oh, we also want to add in CINAHL and a couple of other ones. Anytime I upload another data set, all of the work that I've already done to dedupe it is gone, and I basically have to start there again. So usually I want to dedupe somewhere else. It is helpful, though, once it is in Rayon, I can still see any duplicates that EndNote or RefWorks didn't find. I have at least a way of working with it. So it is frustrating. So you're welcome. So I think maybe I could stop there because I want to make sure we have at least a few minutes for everyone to fill out the poll that's coming up. And this is going to ask in the future what other topics for a webinar series on systematic reviews you might be interested in, and we might be planning some for the future.
Right, so. Great. So I'll go ahead and take the ball back from you, Margaret.
Okay, go ahead.
And before I stop the recording, I did want to do one final thing, which is to be a big shout out, big thank you to Margaret for running this series. We have had some really, really great feedback about the series, and we've mentioned we're doing a poll for future series, so Margaret's interested in even doing more, so we really appreciate all that you've done, Margaret, so thank you very much.
Sure. This has been a great experience. I've learned so much from your questions, and in the chat box, some of you put like some great resources, and I've grabbed those up as well. So I think I just have one quick actual question in here besides the thank yous, and thank you for all the thank yous. Do you keep track of databases and how many articles you deduped? Yes, I do keep track of those. So if I dedupe them in EndNote or RefWorks, I just take note of that, and then any extra ones that Rayon finds, then I just track those as well. So thank you, everyone. And so I think Sarah's going to be putting the poll up.
Yep, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording first.
Okay.